All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Why don't we go ahead and start the show? Dean Harris, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second event in our series on environmental justice. I'm Associate Dean Donald Harris, and I'm here today in my capacity as Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Liaison for Temple Law School. As I did last week, I'll issue a quick disclaimer that I am not an expert in international law and policy, but I'm here to learn along with each of you. My colleague and my dear friend, Professor Amy Sindlin, who is an environmental law expert, continually reminds me that the biggest crisis of our generation is climate change and the issues related to climate change. And in view of the impact climate change has on our generation and on future generations and on society and us individually, I think she has a really strong argument. I view the fight for racial equality and racial justice as an equally compelling crisis, but the reality is that there is no competition here. And as we discussed last week and explored in last week's event, environmental justice is inextricably linked to racial justice, not to mention socioeconomic justice and many other intersecting movements for greater justice and equity. That's where the Green New Deal offers an exciting departure from politics as usual, and why I'm eager to learn a bit more about it today. For those of us who truly believe that a better America is one that genuinely extends its promise of liberty and justice to all, then the Green New Deal offers an opportunity to imagine not just what that might look like, but also how we might get there. Now, I think it's certainly going to come, or at least there's likely to be a cost, including cost to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. And so this is an important part of the conversation, and one that I hope that we'll explore a bit today. Let me offer two final thoughts before turning the mic over to Nilay Shah, who will describe the program in greater detail and also introduce our panel. As law students, and then as lawyers, we can spend a lot of time in the past. So we can study legal principles and case law and statutes that were enacted in different time, a different place, under different circumstances. And when we do so, we sometimes lose sight of the connection between the law as described in the books that we read, and then the law as actually experienced in the lives of people it impacts. There is utility in studying the past, but we must also look forward to imagine a different future and to strive for that different future. Our conversation today invites us to understand law differently, to see it as a future-oriented discipline guided by principles that center real people in its theory and its practice. The second thought came from an article I read earlier this week, and it relates to the first thought. The article was about a veteran of the civil rights era and a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the 1960s. During his interview, he said that they had to protest the 1960s because that was their way of speaking truth to power. And even more because they did not believe they had any actual power other than protesting to effectuate change. We have the ability to engage in the political and legal system, perhaps in ways they did not. We can ask others to join our cause and to ask for help, but we need to recognize that we have the ability to effectuate change. We have committed partners who are leaders in city legislatures, state legislatures, federal government, and other positions of power. So I'm excited, I'm optimistic, I'm inspired today to have state senators, city council members, academic lawyers, all discussing concrete steps that we have taken and that we will take to reach our goals. As we listen to today's speakers, all of our speakers today, and discuss both their work on the Green New Deal and about the future, I encourage you to think about how you can act to move the law toward the future that you want to help create. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Nilay Shah, who will move us forward in the program.
Thank you so much for those excellent opening remarks, Dean Harris. That was really great. Perfect introduction to the Green New Deal. And welcome and thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to our event, the Decade of the Green New Deal. Before we get going, let's talk about how we can make this webinar a little interactive. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, we have a chat feature and a Q&A feature. Throughout the event, please feel free to use the chat feature to react to the things panelists are saying. Honestly, that's going to help us feel less lonely up here on the Zoom stage. And we have about, I think, 60 people currently on this webinar. I expect a few more people to join as well. So I really hope to see the chat exploding with reactions once our panelists start discussing their visions for the Green New Deal. Now, if you have a specific question you would like the panelists to answer, please submit that question through the Q&A feature. When we get to the actual Q&A, I'll read some of those questions to the panelists, and you'll also be able to raise your hand and ask those questions directly. We'll empower you to turn on your mic and directly to engage with the speakers. All right, so now for today's event. Let me just share my screen. The Green New Deal Decade, from platform to policy. So I imagine people are coming to this event with varying degrees of knowledge about the Green New Deal. So I want to take a moment to talk about what the Green New Deal is and to establish some fundamental vocabulary. So what is the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal is both a legislative agenda and a social movement. The legislative agenda is easy to define. In 2019, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey introduced H.R. 109, which called on the federal government to create a Green New Deal. The resolution works like a request for proposals. It sets out a set of goals for the Green New Deal and establishes guiding principles. The Green New Deal is and will be the set of policies we develop within this framework. Specifically, H.R. 109 sets out 5 goals for the Green New Deal. First, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years through a nationwide economic mobilization like those we saw during World War II and the moonshot. Second, providing a just transition by creating millions of dignified unionized jobs that ensure economic prosperity for all. Third, modernizing the nation's infrastructure to bring it into the 21st century. Fourth, securing clean air and water, climate and community resilience, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment for all. And fifth, promoting justice and equity by redressing the historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. But the Green New Deal is more than just a legislative agenda. It's also a social movement. It's an aspirational vision that has emerged from various social movement struggles to reconstruct American society and to achieve multiracial democracy. The Green New Deal draws together the racial justice movement, the environmental justice movement, the indigenous sovereignty movement, the labor movement, and other struggles for justice into a unitary vision for America's future. From these movements, the Green New Deal gets its guiding principles, and those principles are really what make the Green New Deal different from any old infrastructure bill. Those principles include, first, democratizing the political economy, which means private companies and CEOs should not get the final say over what gets built, what gets polluted, and whose work is valued. Second, redistributing power and wealth, which means those who have been the most marginalized should be given the lead in driving change. A third principle is prioritizing community resilience over economic efficiency, which means we should design goods, markets, and infrastructure in ways that strengthen communities by helping them to build power and to withstand climate emergencies, rather than in ways that minimize costs. And a fourth principle is prioritizing equitable distribution over economic growth, which means we should care less about how much business is booming and more about who gets to share in the profits. So in essence, any policy that seeks to advance each of H.R. 109's goals while conforming to these principles is the Green New Deal. Today, we have a set of speakers who have been working to transform pieces of the Green New Deal's aspirational vision into concrete policies. First, we'll hear from 2 academics, Billy Fleming and Akira Rodriguez, that have been designing federal Green New Deal policies like the Green New Deal for public housing and the Green New Deal for public schools. Then around 1:10, we'll hear from State Senator Nikil Saval and City Council members Helen and Kendra about their efforts to win a Green New Deal at the state and local levels. As we hear about these speakers' policy visions, I encourage everyone to think about the goals and principles of the Green New Deal that I've just outlined, and to consider how our speakers have tailored their policies in unique ways to advance those goals and principles. All right. So if any of that sounded exciting to you, let me get some exclamation points and celebratory words in the chat as I start introducing our first set of panelists. So our first panel is going to be, we're going to be hearing from Billy Fleming and Akira Rodriguez. Billy Fleming is Wilkes Family Director of the E&L McHarg Center in the Weitzman School of Design, a senior fellow with Data for Progress, and co-director of the Climate and Community Project. Through the Climate and Community Project, Billy has been developing investment-forward Green New Deal policy proposals that target the intersection of climate justice and the built environment. Billy's research was instrumental to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, which Senator Bernie Sanders introduced in 2019. Prior to joining UPenn, Billy worked as a landscape architect, city planner, organizer, and later in the Obama administration's White House Domestic Policy Council. So we also have Akira Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor at UPenn's Weitzman School in the Department of City and Regional Planning. Her research examines the politics of urban planning, or the ways that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces in the city to gain access to and to sustain urban political power. For the past year, Akira has been developing a framework for the Green New Deal for public schools, and just 2 weeks ago, Representative Jamal Bowman announced his intention to transform that framework into federal legislation. So why don't we start with Akira? Akira, would you mind turning on your camera? There we go. Akira, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your work on the Green New Deal for public schools, your vision, and then we'll get into some discussion of that.
Sure. Do you mind if I share my screen?
Please do.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Temple, Neela. Thank you for all your work on this, for making this probably one of the easiest panels to do. And I'm really honored to be here with our esteemed guests, with my colleague Billy, to talk about this research and policy that we've been working on for some time, and we're happy to see it hopefully materialize in the coming years. So, of course, I can't put this to advance. Okay. So overall, the issue that we see with public schools are we get problems that are quite common in urban planning, and that we have high needs and very little resources. And these are actually used as sort of political wedges in between spaces and places. And so issues around public school as being locally funded through property taxes, the history of racialized property values and differential property values, and the strong role of the federal government in those designations, as well as sort of the federal government's indifference to the lack of equity in between places and states, and largely leaving these issues of public school funding discrepancies and educational outcomes as issues of local matters and local import. However, we see obviously in a place like Philadelphia, which, as you know, is home to 215 school facilities that could be deemed in some degree toxic due to the high level of asbestos, lead, mold, and vermin inside of these schools. You'll see photographs like the one here, do not drink from the sinks, as an indication to what it is like inside of these facilities. However, in addition to these actual structural issues, you have issues within school facilities as it relates to the resources. So at the same time that we saw a massive loss of home equity and wealth in Black and Brown communities with the foreclosure crisis, states were responding to these loss of local and state revenues by decreasing and slashing education budgets. And so you see the loss of teachers, nurses, physicians, recreational arts and music teachers, librarians, guidance counselors, things that are sorely needed more than ever in these communities and in these public schools. So the Green New Deal for K-12 schools is intended to address some of these issues, although of course not all of them. By one, it sort of takes a very sort of strong role of the federal government in providing funding to address these inequities. They threw that through what we hope to see these capital facilities grants, which would fund healthy, green, climate-friendly retrofits for eligible schools. We're looking at schools in the greatest need. So we're looking around issues of social vulnerability that we know contribute not just to a lack of funding within school facilities, but a lack of wealth in the entire neighborhood. And so really thinking holistically about public schools as community infrastructure and ways of building local resilience and funding schools to act in that manner. And so by creating healthy school buildings, we hope to create healthier students and staff, and therefore healthier communities. We also, again, want to address the lack of resources in our sort of public school system, including the staff, social services, training, and professional development that are sort of the first to go. Last night in a Board of Education meeting, they talked about doubling the reimbursement for educators who pay for school supplies out of pocket from, I think, $100 to $200. If anyone's ever gotten school supplies in their life, you know that while folders are 10 cents, once you buy things for 30 and 40 students across several classes, it starts to add up. And teachers are doing so much in their classrooms just to make it a humane and safe space. So buying all of those beautiful cutouts and all of those things that make classrooms look so livable and happy from K to 12 are really things that are quite costly, not to mention some of the things that we value like 3D printers and wonderful tech and arts equipment that would greatly and easily be depleted by $100. So resourcing teachers and educators in that way as well, in addition to expanding some of our entitlement funding. So what the federal government does provide to local schools is quite paltry relative to the scope and scale of their budgets, and so increasing that eligibility as well, again, to address some of these spatial inequities that the federal government has accelerated with their damaging housing and education policies. Eligibility, again, focusing on those who have been marginalized the greatest, whether economically, environmentally, or educationally. So targeting schools with high student-teacher ratios, targeting schools that are in areas that are high environmentally, such as poor air quality, high levels of lead, and also thinking about socioeconomic status. And so looking at census data, again, as another way of targeting these funds to those who need it most. We also want to pay special attention to groups that are traditionally marginalized spatially, such as facilities that are housing incarcerated juveniles, wards of the state, as well as our tribal schools. The benefit would be massive. We are still kind of in the process of crunching the numbers. As we get more support for this policy, we think we can dedicate more resources to it. And so with the $250 billion that would go to 33,000 schools, a third of our public schools in the country, that would be essentially the same as removing 6 million cars off the road. And so if we could do that by just targeting a third of our schools with deep retrofits, imagine what we could do if we targeted all of the schools in the country. Similarly, the retrofitting and the maintenance of these facilities would create 350,000 jobs per year over the course of a decade, including 100,000 on-site construction jobs and maintenance jobs. It would also create 336,000 jobs in schools. And so we really want to prioritize building up the pipeline. We're not here to do a remix of what the federal government has done in the past, which is providing a bunch of resources and then sort of clawing them back once the federal well is dry. And so we really want to increase capacity for hiring, for training, for development, and also for states to absorb some of those costs in the future to maintain those levels, to reduce those high ratios. The values of the plan are around these different forms of equity, primary among them being health and environmental equity. And so we are interested in creating models and retrofits that, again, benefit both the school and the community towards an era of zero carbon schools and zero energy new builds. We're also looking at creating that infrastructure, thinking holistically about the site of school facilities, which are often ignored, and using that as a way of building local resilience against climate change, from flooding to extreme heating and cooling. We're also thinking, of course, about educational equity. We're looking at the funding assisted educators, addressing issues of curriculum mismatch. There's been, of course, a great deal of issues around culturally competent and relevant education in this country. And it is time to sort of affirm these community curriculums by prioritizing and professionalizing development for that, as well as, again, staffing our libraries, health offices, and mental health and wellness centers, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, and thinking about how critical those services are for the schools and communities at large. And finally, economic equity. Our schools that are in our highest need neighborhoods are not just the students in those schools, but also the caretakers that support them and the community members. And so prioritizing local hiring and green unionized jobs that pay, again, that living wage is a way of sort of not just redeveloping the community for the sake of providing some economic activity, but thinking holistically about how schools can operate as that critical infrastructure in the community. With regards to my legal friends in the room, I'm really excited to thinking about the role of lawyers going forward in the Green New Deal, particularly at the local level. Of course, there's always a need for a Green New Deal legal squad out of the federal level, defending some of these states' rights and federal intervention. But at the local level is when it gets really dicey. School boards and school districts are quite uneven across the US, and there is a need for local knowledge and local advocacy that would create this capacity and accountability that is needed. Policies are only as good as the oversight that comes with them. And often we know in the past that the Department of Education and the federal government have not been the best at enforcing some of these equitable legislations and attempts. And so it is really critical to have that capacity at the local and state level as well. The end, of course, is transforming public education, not thinking of it as something that ends after the 12th grade, but something that both as a priority and a policy, but also in the quality of the facilities and spaces, something that is quite integral to communities and to city and just sort of our general quality of life. And so thinking about here we have a protest from over the summer and all of these different movements in front of the school district, and really thinking strategically about how some of these issues and political divides, we can start to heal some of those fractures through the transformation of public education. But we still do need a legal squad. So there will be a lot of resistance to this sort of federal intervention around things that are traditionally local, which typically means traditionally white and led by homeowners. And so we need advocates, like I said, at multiple levels of government in order to address the advocacy as well as the implementation and accountability around these initiatives. So happy to answer questions, and thank you again.
All right, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I think we should pause for a moment to ask some Q&A right now, and then we'll do that for a little bit just to flesh out what you've already discussed. Then we'll move on to Billy's presentation, and then we'll do a broader Q&A with both you and Billy all at once at the end. So one question came in through the Q&A, which I accidentally moved to the answered column because I'm still trying to figure out how to use this Q&A function, but I think it's a really important question, so I'd like to read it to you. Stephen Jessen Howard had asked, could this Green New Deal for public schools be applied to childcare and pre-K facilities as well as K through 12? And I'll add one kind of like extra thing I'd like to discuss onto that question. We talked about, and I think this came up in your presentation, but we talked about how the retrofits themselves will create a lot of jobs, employment in the school will create a lot of jobs. But can we talk about like what is a low carbon job and how are these kinds of investments in teachers and in counselors and such inherently low carbon investments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly thinking about these low carbon jobs, we do want to think about the implications going forward, how we won't have to kind of go out and redo a lot of, there's a lot of duplication, I guess is a good way of saying that, and a lot of waste that I feel like comes out of how schools are currently run because they're so strapped for resources. And so because schools are frequently having to deal with huge infusions of cash with very short turnover. We see things like a lack of transparency and even sort of guidance around things like asbestos remediation. And so we get lots of different remediations with different levels of quality and with very little transparency and accountability to the public. And so I think that's definitely something to think about as we think about sort of creating these in-house carbon jobs. And so really focusing on utilizing CTE, utilizing those local hiring practices as a way to, again, ground this into the community and create this sort of buy-in. The idea that the school is sort of built for you, by you, is really, I think, a helpful way of thinking about it as sort of investing in the community and in that infrastructure. I feel like I did not answer the first part of the question now.
The first part was just about extending it to pre-K facilities.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's funny, as I was kind of adjusting some of the notes on it over the weekend, I thought about pre-K and early childhood education. And certainly we want to take this, from early childhood all the way up through higher ed. But at this point, the pre-K and early childhood environment is even more fractured than K-12 in terms of who oversees it. And so I think from that perspective, I certainly wouldn't want to limit what this could be spent on. But I do know that historically the K-12 is an easier way of administering this sort of fund and aid, but I definitely support it.
I guess that's up to us to create the political conditions to make it possible, right?
For sure.
So we have a couple more questions coming in from the audience. First is, how do you envision the order of operations in implementing structural changes to education infrastructure? And I think a part of that question is also, while incrementalism is often criticized, it seems pragmatic to consider what must be done first and what policy goals can be integrated into the new system later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't really, the order of operations, to me, it's just like sort of getting the funding in. Selling the policy, I think, is going to be a very sort of difficult thing in terms of getting that buy-in. It is something that administratively is going to be quite new, but also the idea of focusing this level of effort into school facilities, I think, is also kind of unique. And so I think a lot of education policy gets mired in this sort of ideology of what, the role of the federal government should be. But in the case of creating it as something that is more infrastructure, it feels a little more in the federal government's wheelhouse. And perhaps that is always a better way to lead. Likewise, we think that by focusing some of the resources on these sort of assistant jobs, librarian jobs that may be sort of outside of the traditional purview of a teachers union, we're hopeful that we can get not just the buy-in, but also make sure that we're not selling any sort of stakeholders short by clawing back those resources. And so we really want to show the federal government as a leader, but also increasing the capacity of the states with the eventual goal of getting the states to take over some of these qualities and responsibilities.
So another question that came in from the audience is, what do you say to people, and I think this is a question that's going to be recurring throughout this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to the people who say the initial cost to kickstart a Green New Deal in public schools is too large? What kind of economic pressure does this put on the schools themselves?
Yeah, it's actually not a lot of money when you look at it per school. So actually for 33,000 schools, $250 billion ends up being $7 million a school over, the cost and the number of teachers, for example, I even put for Philadelphia would end up being about 600 jobs. And so these are, of course, when you're looking at a program over 10 years, it looks huge, but it's $50 billion a year, which is really nothing. And so we put these numbers in these different ways so that people can see the larger impact. But when you break it down into an annual and state by state and district by district and school by school, the costs are actually quite minimal and would maybe even push people to ask for more. And I think certainly that is the point of this sort of community engaged legislation, is that we want it to be something that shifts that window where we're saying, okay, this is what a school could be. This is something that we can invest in. This is something that we can push our local and our state and our suburban neighbors into funding and thinking about more comprehensively. And so we also are trying to lead by example in that way to create other forms of downstream policies to support that. Certainly, we're not trying to put this on our most vulnerable schools.
So this is a question that I would just like to to talk about. This didn't come in from the audience, but a question that I think is helped me to understand what the Green New Deal is all about is, could you talk a little bit about what schools as resilience infrastructure looks like? Like, what does it mean for a school to be a center through which communities can become more resilient or have resilience infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So resilience is an interesting term, but to me, it's about addressing these sort of extreme hazards, but also kind of the slow violence. And so I think that schools during COVID have been interesting sites of infrastructure that we should expand upon, right? And so the idea that you're acting as sites of laptops, of food, of information and social services, all of these really sort of community level goods and needs to the students in a very sort of public way that make it very much a public space in ways that we haven't seen before. We're used to seeing schools as sort of shut down at 6 o'clock at night. You can't gather thereafter. It requires a certain insurance. The security to get in and out of schools for obvious reasons has been quite intense. And so it doesn't feel like a welcoming space. And so we think that there is, some value in opening up public schools, both in the local knowledge and infrastructure, but also in the outcomes that come out of that. What does it mean for a school to feel safe and welcoming to not just students, but members of the community? Well, it means when it's time to close a school, people are like upset about it, right? They're not like, "Whew, thank God." They're like, "Oh, that's horrible. No one would even propose that." And so that to me is when schools become infrastructure, where your reaction to a closed school is like a reaction to a closed park, like it just wouldn't happen.
Great. And so here's another question from the audience. What classes will you offer students of public schools to educate them about the need to participate in creating the Green New Deal? Yeah, and I think I'll have a follow-up question after that, but we'll start with that one.
Yeah, the school curriculum, I think, is really open to what we think the communities need. So the Green New Deal doesn't look the same in every community. There are some affluent communities where the Green New Deal may look like creating less sprawling traffic and more sort of denser human scale patterns so that there's less environmental harm that way. For a high need district or a high need school, it may look a little different. And so I think certainly it's about bringing together, again, this sort of local knowledge and this sort of global knowledge of thinking very sort of comprehensively about what it means to even be green. I think we do focus way too much on the little, like the color, right? So we're thinking like, oh, stormwater and like gardens or whatever, where it could be like Wi-Fi, right? Or healthcare. And so I think that the Green New Deal, it's a good name, but it's not really encompassing all of the possibilities. A Green New Deal could just be like a police-free school, depending on where you are. And so we want to also think about leaving a lot of that local capacity and local knowledge to the implementers of the policy as well.
And something that stuck out to me in some of the conversations we've had about the Green New Deal for public schools And I think that this really makes this like a Green New Deal program, is the degree to which the idea like facilitates community planning and facilitates collaborative and participatory democracy. Can you talk a little bit about like those features of the vision and how it is that this policy would facilitate community control, community collaboration, and planning?
Yeah, it needs a plan, right? And I don't say that as someone who's just invested in the idea of planning by being a planning professor, but you need to show that you've engaged the community, you have an idea of what the community needs, and you're using the money responsively, right? It should not be the plan of just the administrators, because we know that there is some tension and some divergence, right? It's been the question earlier about order of operations, like this year has been illustrative of what schools can do, but also illustrative of like some of the real harms in school governance and administration. And I feel like there's been a lot of backlash against educators to return into classrooms. There's been a lot of tensions with caregivers around the transparency around school reopenings. And then there's just been a lot of pressure on school districts to reopen generally from, you know, people who are not even in the school, right? From businesses and mayors and public health officials. And so these factions are like fighting over pennies, basically, right? Like this idea that we have these limited resources for schools. We all have very sort of competing needs and interests, and nothing has been done to sort of facilitate those divides. And so I do think that throwing a bunch of money at the problem is not going to solve the problem if these groups can't collaborate and cooperate. And so there does have to be some pumping of the brakes, right? And I think a planning process can provide that, where we say, okay, here's the technical assistance, here's the data, here are the eligible schools, here are some ideas for what you can fund. And having schools that compete for these grants provide a plan that has a community value statement, that affirms a local hiring practice, that looks at the local curriculum, that maybe, you know, brings in these sort of other schools that may be seen as alternative or traditional, and making sure they're included. So looking at a bunch of different localized plans, but understanding truly that we need to really rebuild this trust and think about these fractures, or it's just not going to work.
And also, I'll take a moment to say, if anyone else in the audience would like to submit a question or just raise your hand and ask a question, that's totally cool. You can do that right now. And in fact, I will just stop talking for 1 minute to see if that happens. And by 1 minute, I mean just 5 seconds, because that's about as long as I can go. I do have another question for you, which is, you know, one aspect of the Green New Deal for public schools is developing, is like encouraging school districts to form regional planning committees. And can you just talk to me a little bit about like why, and I guess two things. One is, why is it important to facilitate regional planning outside of the school districts that currently exist in their current boundaries? And two, how does that relate to a redistribution of power, or a kind of a, you know, a different approach to how decisions are currently made?
Sure. In thinking about the wicked problems I really didn't get to in the weeds with school funding, but it is a critical issue when thinking about equity, particularly when you look at areas that have been traditionally high wealth, usually racially and economically exclusionary, and can afford to fund public schools almost at the expense of other school districts that are struggling, who have to sort of use their funds in different ways and make their dollars stretch more because they have these higher needs of a student population as well as a community population. And so the purpose of this is borrowing a bit from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and their affirmatively furthering fair housing planning process that looked at these issues and said, these are not issues of individual cities or suburbs making excellent or terrible decisions, but this issue around federal policy that created these jurisdictional boundaries. And so similarly, we know that local schools are funded predominantly through local property taxes, and we know that local property taxes are quite racialized and biased, that we need to create new funding instruments to incentivize cooperation between suburbs and cities to create better fair funding. And so this is not, I think so often it is on the backs of those in cities and those who are disenfranchised to push towards greater equity. And so this would create an incentive where there is a regional cooperation that would value those who have historically been marginalized. And so equity is awarded based on the amount of need that you serve and not so much what you've accomplished since we started measuring this, right? It looks very sort of longitudinally at that. And so we wanted to create a documented history of funding and equity between regions, a mechanism to induce greater cooperation and sharing of funding, and as well as, again, creating something for local communities and activists to push back on and use as a tool and measure of accountability so that these sort of issues don't fall by the wayside as we invest deeper into our schools and facilities.
And I think it would be helpful for, especially the law students in this Zoom room to talk about sort of like how you got into this line of work, or rather, how did you get involved in school, like a Green New Deal for public schools, and particularly your involvement with community groups and organizing efforts, before it actually became the Green New Deal for public schools?
Sure. As a planning researcher, I was largely interested in issues around neighborhood change and capacity. And I actually started looking at public schools by looking at Friends of groups, which are sort of private fundraising groups for public schools in different cities. I was looking predominantly at Philadelphia, but of course they're kind of in Chicago and DC and Boston, all over. And there was certainly a relationship between this increased fundraising for public schools and, the types of neighborhoods that were attracting new residents and experiencing growth and stability over time. And so I found that as an interesting way of thinking about neighborhood revitalization was by looking at the role of public schools, which of course had tons of inequities baked into them, including some of these groups, which were not through any fault of their own, but sort of the same thing that happens when a bunch of money comes into one particular place. It makes that place quite attractive to others. And so it's not that they were inducing gentrification, but it was certainly something that was accelerating it in a way that I don't think anyone was totally comfortable with. And so thinking about how these issues are inherently spatial was really sort of interesting to me. As it relates to the Green New Deal, I actually was talking to Billy and Daniel as they were doing their work with the Green New Deal for public housing, and kind of mentioning offhand that in the first New Deal, FDR was kind of like against giving money to schools and teachers, and was like very much like, no, we're not doing that at all, and invested in like every other form of public infrastructure. And so this is very much a way of kind of addressing that issue and that oversight in the first go round. Not to say that there weren't tons of schools that were constructed in different forms, both in the New Deal and during urban renewal, but certainly the kind of failure to reinvest since those moments 70 and 100 years ago. We see that in our current fabric.
All right, well, thank you so much. So our second panelist, Billy, is currently, he got tied up in a phone call, such is life in the age of Zoom. So I think what I would like to do now is just like open the floor to further questions for Akira, if anybody else wants to jump in. And hopefully Billy will be able to join us again in a couple of minutes. If not, I do see that the elected officials who are going to be on our second panel are currently like in attendance at this event. Maybe if we don't hear any questions in the next couple of minutes, we'll just move on to the elected officials section, and we'll kind of bring it all back together at the very end.
Sure, sounds good.
But first, let's just pause. Anybody want to jump in with a question? Feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. You can ask your question verbally, or you can just submit the question through the Q&A feature. So we did just get a question in from the audience. How will the Green New Deal for public school, or the Green New Deal for schools, address the problem of for-profit private schools and charters?
I don't know if it will address the problem of those two institutions. I think that they will, charter schools will be eligible. Charter schools are public schools. In Philadelphia, for example, we have neighborhood charters, so your local school could very well be a charter school. So we don't want to exclude them because the charter landscape is very different across states and cities, and even from organization to organization. And so it's very difficult to sort of use that as a broad stroke. I will say of all the schools in the US, K to 12, private schools are 10% of them. So they're pretty small relative to everything, and charter schools are also not this huge portion of them. And so I'm very interested in making sure that schools are healthy for children, and that is the ultimate goal. And so I really, it is something that politically you like to be very aware of with regards to charter versus non-charter, private and public. But we hope by kind of keeping a very broad scope that we can keep it as equitable as possible and not exclusionary. I see the other question, examples of Green New Deal type initiatives from outside the states or in the states that are a good proof of concept. Certainly there are initiatives to green infrastructure. However, I can't say that at this scale, at the state level, that we have these shining examples. Largely, these are, the actual upfront costs of these investments are so great, and cities and municipalities are just so cash strapped, particularly the ones that need it the most. I think it would be, off the top of my head, I know I haven't really seen anything that we could use as a good proof of concept. But I was gonna say, yeah, if Billy hops on, he can answer that more extensively.
Yeah, so I just got a message from Billy that he should be hopping back on any second now.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so let's pin that question too, because I don't want to like sell or undersell what could be happening right now, maybe even in my own backyard. Are there good ways of sustainably funding public schools that isn't from segregated communities, creating their own tax bases? I really can't speak to school funding abroad. It's not, I am a person that studies community organizing and political power. And so I don't want to sell myself as someone who is well-versed in education policy. I will say that certainly there are ways of funding public schools that aren't based on segregated communities creating their own tax bases, and we hope that this is a way of doing it. Again, it is the ideology of the US to have local control and very little government oversight and interference with matters of the family, which is how you kind of get that resistance against, for example, even pre-K and early childhood spending. And so you have to kind of navigate these things carefully in a way to not reinforce, obviously, these inequities, but at the same time, understanding that these are political fights that are going to be resisted heavily at local and state levels that feel like they are having to subsidize the other. And so we're trying to couch it in a way that is very sort of federal forward and allowing states to opt in not be exclusionary or coercive in that way.
And, actually, I know I'm supposed to be moderating this, but I do have one thing I'd like to add to that comment, because Akira and I have discussed this in some other conversations. But part of the regional equity planning vision would be basically creating a process around which community groups can organize to eventually shift the way of thinking within a region about what is their school, like what is their school zone, who are their neighbors. So, as Akira said, there definitely will be resistance to the idea of moving away from like a property tax-based system of funding schools. But the hope is that by creating these infrastructures through which different districts can be communicating and different community groups can be communicating and agitating and these kinds of things for federal funds, you can actually build those relationships, which will hopefully translate into a lasting change in the way people understand their school district. Is that, Akira, does that sound right, or is that on point?
It feels very much like the legal answer should be.
All right, well, Akira, thank you so much for answering all these questions, and also everyone, thank you for your patience. Again, 2020 plus one, this is life. But luckily, Billy is back, and he is going to tell us a little bit about the Green New Deal for public housing.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, and thanks for putting up with me being all over the place today. These are like all my favorite people in one Zoom. This is the only place I would prefer to be today, but life is getting in the way. So I'm going to talk about certainly the public housing work that Neil mentioned, which is really, I'm happy to talk about it. That work, at least, on my end, has really been led by Daniel Cohen here on the research side, and obviously by the People's Action Homes Guarantee on the movement side, and by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Sanders in Congress. Have been happy to play a supporting role there. But I'm going to talk about it kind of in the context of this group, Climate and Community Project, which is kind of an offshoot of some of that public housing work that began a few years ago. We're very fortunate to have both Neil and Akira involved in this work. Akira leading a bunch of just phenomenal public education work tied to the climate crisis for us, and Neil sort of jumping in on basically every project we have to lawyer it up for us, and to do many other things. But this CCP, Climate and Community Project, just as a sort of quick primer, is really situated to kind of connect the demands of the climate justice movement to the policy development process, and to sort of recognize that, at least in the academy, we have a fair amount of resources and a fair amount of access. We don't often have very radical ideas. Those are actually coming from, in this case, the housing justice movement. And so we've really seen our role as trying to translate that into the kind of work that legislators like the folks who are on here with us today, council members Gimmon Brooks and Senator Saval, who are really interested in pushing those ideas forward through legislation, and don't often or don't always have the in-house capacity to do so. So we've kind of become, a place that fills in some of those gaps. And I think, Neil mentioned this at the beginning, but have done so by kind of really viewing HR 109, the Green New Deal, as an invitation to collaborate, which is literally how Representative Ocasio-Cortez framed it in this press conference, introducing it a couple of years ago, saying that we should view HR 109 not as an endpoint, but as a framework for collaboration and an RFP of sorts, of request for proposals. So that it was now time for us to get to work. And sitting in a design school, that meant looking at HR 109 through the kind of built environment lens. And obviously it offers all kinds of things that are not spatial, but also does include a lot of things that we think have to sort of force designers and planners to rethink how they work and where they work and with whom they align themselves. Certainly in places where you have the luxury of operating outside of market forces like a university. And so I won't read through this whole list. This is, these are the various provisions of HR 109 that call out, the investments in the built environment that we've tried to make the sort of core work of CCP. Ones that are probably most germane for this conversation, right, are retrofitting every existing building in the country for max water and energy efficiency, overhauling the U.S. transportation system, remediating every hazmat or brownfield site. Any one of those would be kind of a generational project. To see them all kind of clustered together, I think just gives you a sense of the ambition that's embedded in HR 109, imperfect as it might be. And again, just quickly, CCP kind of sits at this space between social movements who are making the most, I think, compelling and interesting and to the scale of the crisis demands of the moment, with legislators who are interested in pushing those demands through legislation and changing the terms of debate in Congress and state legislatures and city councils, and doing it with this really fabulous, collection of comrades and collaborators, which includes Akira, includes Daniel here at Penn, but also includes Olufemi Taiwo down at Georgetown, Mijun Cha at Occidental in California, and all kinds of others you can see on here. And that work began to sort of crystallize a couple of years ago as this project, a Green New Deal for American Public Housing Communities, took off, led by Daniel Cohen here, and included collaborations with lots of other folks, Julian Brake-Noiscat, Akira McDonald, a couple of grad students here at Penn, Nick Gratz, Katie Lampel. Katie has since graduated and is working on this piece of legislation now from Senator Jeff Merkley's office, Zan Lulahai, Mark Paul, and Ananya Bahanda. And this was a project brought to us not by, a bunch of housers who were interested, in the sort of abstractions of housing policy, but by Tara Agbar, Paniela Ng, and others at People's Action and the sort of Homes Guarantee and Movement School, who are really interested, have been demanding for quite a long time that we take these historic sites of disinvestment and stigmatization, which are public housing, communities in the United States, and put them at the front of the line for the investment side of the rollout of the Green New Deal. In part because, it allows us to avoid some of the messy questions of ownership that other housing, policy might complicate. And also because it puts communities that have historically been at the back of the line, if they're in line at all, for federal investment at the front of the line. And did so through this sort of deliberative process, this back and forth with our friends at the Homes Guarantee and these different members of Congress. This is again Congressman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders introducing the bill that was based in large part on that policy brief I just showed you. I think if you were to zoom this frame out like just the smidge, you would see Daniel Cohen like smiling very, very wide just to the right of Senator Sanders there. But they rolled this out, based on the provisions in the report that they're kind of shown here. That we're calling for an investment of somewhere between 119 and 172 billion in deep energy retrofits, and importantly also in public health abatements in the units. So by HUD zone admission, there's somewhere between 60 and 80 billion or so full of lead and asbestos and poor ventilation, deferred maintenance, and other public health issues in the 1.2 or so million units of existing public housing in the country. And so part of our work was really just to say, like, one, you have an obligation to clean all of that shit up. And that two, as long as you're doing that to sort of limit the amount of disruption that's going to go into any kind of retrofit or repair work, why not also maximize the deep energy retrofits while you do it, and turn these sites into like temples of public luxury, which is a pretty common refrain in the housing movement or housing justice movement. Again, would create almost 4 million jobs per year across multiple sectors. Many of those were able to tie to public housing residents themselves. A couple of different provisions in federal housing law that allow us to do this, and will reduce all kinds of utility costs for the residents themselves, or at least if those are borne by a public housing authority for the city or the municipality that manages them. So 30% of water bill costs would be cut, 70% of all energy bills would be cut. Would take about 5.5 million or so metric tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year, and then would obviously, most importantly, immediately improve the quality of life measures for the over 2 million people who live in public housing in this country. And just to kind of close this out here, I should say, stepping into design school and also feeling really ambivalent about architecture, was extraordinarily excited to see probably the largest award or the most important award in architecture in the world. Just a couple of days ago, go to the French architects, Lacazon and Fassal, who have built probably the most important model for green social housing in the world. You're seeing a quick snippet of it here outside of the Bordeaux region in France. They're also kind of infamous for turning down big private luxurious commissions and taking, if they're asked to do a public-private partnership redevelopment of a sort of town square in a medium-sized town in France, I just say actually all that's needed here is like a little bit of signage, a little bit of repaving, a little bit of paint, and things are fine. We don't want to accelerate gentrification pressures. It's made them kind of an enemy to some of the global elite of architecture, but I think is quite an important signal that they've now won the most prestigious award an architect can win. And I think we could all, learn a lot more from the work they've been able to do in France. And I'll just say, to kind of end this here, I can tell this was a long time ago, actually, because my hair couldn't fit in a bun like it does now. But in addition to the education work that Akira has led so kind of masterfully for us, have a bunch of other work kind of coming out with this crew later in the spring. Some of it focused on transportation infrastructure, some of it focused on public utilities, some of it again focused on public housing and public schools. But with that, I will stop talking, Eli, and turn it back over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much. That's awesome. It's all very exciting. I do have some questions, but I want to give everyone a second to chime in from the audience if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question directly or submit a question through the Q&A. Yeah, let's give that 1 second to see if that percolates. In the meantime, I'll also just explain that we'll basically spend the next like 8 or 10 minutes talking about Q&A with Billy. And then I think we should move on to the elected officials after that. And then Billy and Akira, if you both happen to have any time to hang around, maybe at the very end of the event, we can just open it up like a large Q&A for everyone to get involved for any questions that can't get answered right now. Cool. All right, so I'll start us off with a question. So Billy, if you could just talk, so I do want to talk a little bit about the details of the Green New Deal for public housing, just to give people a better sense of like what it means to design Green New Deal policy. So obviously, like we talk about retrofits, we talk about decarbonization, but there's a specific line item in the legislation that accounts for like directing funding to the painting of facilities. And can you talk a little bit about like why is that an important policy feature to build into the legislation itself?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different reasons, right? You know, the building materials that were used for most American public housing are like absurdly toxic, right? So this is why you find lead and asbestos kind of peppered throughout, you know, public housing and lots of other units of sort of buildings in the country, but especially public housing. So the painting is important for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, it's one way to think about abating some of the lead paint. You have to do some removal, but also topping it off is like one of the ways you abate it. On the building material external side too, the cladding and the painting are both ways to relatively cheaply and really efficiently do some of the deep energy retrofits to keep all of the, you know, the heat or the air from kind of escaping out of older and poorly constructed buildings. It's also, you know, a way of thinking about raising the albedo effect of some of the buildings. So you can think about like very dark buildings as obviously absorbing a lot of heat, contributing to urban heat island problems, also contributing to, you know, the need for the use of more air conditioning that might otherwise be necessary in some of the units. So there's this like there's this nexus of different kind of both public health, larger environmental or climate related problems that aren't solved by painting it, but can be, you know, I think in some ways marginally impacted by it. And those are the kinds of jobs too that we're able to at least, you know, call out in the legislation as being set aside for at least for the right of first refusal to current public housing residents.
Yeah, and that's a current refrain, like a consistent refrain throughout the legislation is ensuring that like the first jobs always go to current you know, individuals who are already in the housing. There's the idea of a public housing community member, and that's like a category within the legislation. So for all the law students who are listening to this and all the lawyers, I think that's something that like we should all really be thinking about, you know, when we write policy, how do we actually define terms and define categories to ensure that the people that are most often marginalized or not, you know, not taken into consideration in the development policy actually benefit the most from the policies we're designing.
Yeah,
Billy, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, you know, in this way, like we've benefited immensely from having you and other, you know, sort of folks trained in law and in schools of law involved in this work. I mean, I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, right? But like Neela, you know, as a I don't know, first or second year law student at Temple, were like pinging Daniel and I to come join a class he and I were co-teaching last spring. That class benefited immensely from having you in it. We wouldn't have had anyone else with any legal training in there. The same is true for this brief. It would have not been, I think, nearly as compelling, nearly as feasible, nearly as like impactful as it has the potential to be if we didn't have folks from the legal world involved in producing it. And by that I mean like beyond the Ledge Council folks in Congress, who are great, but like they're not going to be folks who are kind of taking some hard ideological stances on ways to write legislation. They're going to do what we ask them to do.
Thanks, Billy. That's really kind of you. And also for all the law students on this call, that's the call to action. So that's for us. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about, Billy. Actually, Billy, would you mind just talking a little bit about the like GND and decarceration stuff that you're beginning to explore in your studios? Is that all right? Okay, so let me ask you a question just to set that up. So over the summer, during the uprising and the protest, I remember observing, like on Twitter and in general, a lot of legal commentators were responding to the demands of the movement for Black Lives, basically saying things like, this is impossible, or like the law doesn't provide for this in the budgeting process, we can't get this money back, blah, blah, blah. really coming up with like every reason that the movement can't get what it's demanding. And I found that very frustrating because I remember thinking like, as lawyers, we're always trained to try as hard as we can to like make our clients' needs and desires possible and to find a way to make things work. And it doesn't seem like lawyers often respond to movements that way. By contrast, I feel like the way that your studio and subsequently Climate and Community Project have responded to some of these demands is like a breath of fresh air. Could you talk a little bit about the work you're doing on that decarceration stuff? And maybe also like the way it ties into movement demands.
For sure. So I'm going to throw this image up too. So if folks in here have been around the school, they probably know this, but if not, I've just finished the second year of kind of a 3-year Green New Deal studio sequence. It puts city planners, landscape architects and architects who are in their final year of study at Penn kind of together to ask some of these hard questions about, what the build out of the Green New Deal might mean. And over the course of those couple of years, I've asked them to kind of narrow in on some priority regions. One of those is Appalachia, one's the Mississippi Delta, one's the Corn Belt of the Midwest. In the second year, the year we just finished, I also asked them to focus in particular on the fossil fuel industry, the industrial agriculture system, and the carceral system. And lots of reasons for that. The most important is just that, the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, there was some merging of operations from the Green New Deal Network, which is kind of the national organizing table for Green New Dealers, and the movement for Black Lives. So not every thing they do is totally coordinated, but there is some strategy and communication and sort of advocacy coordination going on now. And those were the 3 industries sort of put forward after that sort of merger of operations as critical pillars to take on in the march towards a Green New Deal and a march towards racial justice. And so in the studio, what you're looking at here are a bunch of prison sites built atop abandoned coal mines in Appalachia. And the bottom right there, you're seeing in gray all of the coal mines, the red dots are all the correctional facilities built atop them. And have found throughout the course of this work that it's the majority use for the most common use for abandoned mine lands in Appalachia is just to remain abandoned. The second most common use is to be converted to some type of prison or detention facility. The reasons for that are kind of threefold. One is that there's a specific federal grant program for doing exactly that in Appalachia. There are monies that are only available for prison building atop abandoned mine lands. The second is that these sites obviously are already cleared and flat. They're strip mines, and so they're ideal for building of kind of any kind. We just are funneling all of the money for building things on them into prisons. And the third is that, actually to put incarcerated people on this site, you do not have to remediate them to the same standard you would for many other uses. So there's this really toxic sort of nexus of, subsidy and regulatory or financial subsidies and regulatory subsidies for building this prison system in these places and doing it through this really, sort of toxic rural economic development program that promises jobs and, economic impact at the price of both human immiseration, obviously, but also has never actually delivered on any of those promises. Does not produce the level of construction jobs or permanent jobs that were promised, and the ones it does produce are incredibly traumatizing, both for the people who are working them and the people who are incarcerated there. And so what we've tried to think about in the studio are how do we think through some alternative rural economic development programs? Like how would we think about redirecting subsidies and into what to maybe not like abolish prisons overnight, but to begin the process to say step 1 through 10 is this decommissioning decarceration project in places like Appalachia where there's a really obvious political wedge to drive. And that we can think about then redirecting those funds and that regulatory attention into building things that are, not immiserative and that live up to the promises they've made to people in places like Appalachia. And those, my students are phenomenal and really committed, and I think have put a bunch of different ideas forward for how to do that. Could talk about them forever, but I won't. I'll kind of stop there and let you jump back in.
Awesome. All right. Well, I feel like there's probably a million questions that people would like to follow up about that stuff, but it is 1:10, so I'd like to move on to the elected officials. If people have questions for Billy about that work or just questions you want to address towards Akira and Billy collectively, save those for the very end, and we'll come back for like a massive Q&A free-for-all. It'll be super great. All right, so that being said, thank you again, Billy and Akira, for speaking. Let's move on to our panel with elected officials. We are very lucky today to be joined by sorry, let me just pull up my notes so I can move through this properly. Okay, so we are very lucky today to be joined by Senator Nikil Saval from the Pennsylvania State Senate. City Council Member Helen Kim from the Philadelphia City Council, and City Council Member Kendra Brooks, also from Philadelphia City Council. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, I'll give a quick introduction to each of these individuals, and then I'll give each of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what the Green New Deal means for you, and then we'll have a Q&A and open it up. All right, so for quick introductions, Senator Nikil Saval represents the 1st District in the Pennsylvania Senate. Before being elected to his seat last year, Senator Saval was a writer, journalist, magazine editor, and labor organizer. Senator Saval is now the Pennsylvania Senate's leading voice for enacting the Green New Deal for Pennsylvania. He currently sits on the Appropriations Committee and serves as the Democratic chair of the Urban Affairs and Housing Committee. Sorry, one second. Sorry, everyone, just lost my place in my notes. Again, thank you for your patience with with the Zoom world. All right, so now, Councilmember Kendra Brooks. Councilmember Brooks is an at-large member of Philadelphia City Council. She is also the first Working Families Party member to have been elected to City Council. Councilmember Brooks has deep roots working across movement building organizations throughout the city. She's currently focused on fighting for housing as a human right, advocating for well-funded public education, protecting workers' rights, and laying the groundwork for a Green New Deal for Philadelphia. And finally, Councilmember Helen Kim. Councilmember Kim is also an at-large city council member and a longtime educator and community organizer. She was elected to city council in 2016, and since then she's been a champion for a human rights agenda for housing, public education, environmental, racial, and economic justice. She has won clean water access and regular lead testing for drinking water in Philly schools, called for the closure of the PES refinery, and is now leading a call for a $1 billion modernization campaign to make healthy, sustainable, modern, and green schools a mandate for every school child in Philadelphia. She has also established groundbreaking legislation, such as the nation's first anti-retaliation law for workers reporting violations of COVID public health orders, also mandatory advanced scheduling for hospitality and retail workers, and the city's first law guaranteeing a right to legal counsel in landlord-tenant court for low-income residents facing eviction. So to summarize, we have 3 incredible advocates for justice, each of whom comes from a tradition of organizing. And in fact, I think many of you were actually at a Teamsters Union rally this morning, standing up for workers' rights. And I think that's exactly the kind of leadership we need in this city and in this state. So thank you for doing that. Our hope is that through this panel discussion, we can all get a better sense of not only what the Green New Deal for Pennsylvania and Philadelphia would look like, but also how we can win it. We'll start by giving each panelist an opportunity to talk about what the Green New Deal means to them, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So why don't we start with Senator Saval?
Thank you, Nilay, and thank you, Temple Law, for arranging this. Is phenomenal, and always great to be on with Council Members Kim and Brooks, like 2 great comrades in this fight for a Green New Deal. So I do uncharacteristically have created slides at the last minute, which I rarely do, but so let's hope just for something to look at so I'm going to see if this works. So let's see. There we go. So I'll start a little bit by what I think Council Members Kim and Brooks and I share a lot of perspectives on these issues and a lot of the same policy goals, but I'll talk a little bit about the state perspective here. So this is a map of fracking sites across Pennsylvania. That those green dots represent kind of concentrations of fracking wells. And let's look at the far west there, where you see the highest concentration. So from the years of 2006 to 2017 in 4 counties in southwestern Pennsylvania, 31 people were diagnosed with a rare form of cancer known as Ewing sarcoma. This is a 40% increase over the same period through 2005. There were 6 cases in Washington County, Pennsylvania, which occurred, 6 of those cases occurred in Washington County, Pennsylvania, occurring in children who actually attended a single school district. Now, 1,800 fracking wells have been drilled in Washington County, Pennsylvania. This is a fracking pad in Washington County. It is the most drilled county in our Commonwealth. It is widely believed that the health effects of fracking have some connection to the illnesses striking children throughout Western Pennsylvania. A journalistic investigation by Environmental Health News found that carcinogens like benzene in drinking water and air samples, and breakdown products for chemicals like ethyl benzene, styrene, and toluene in the bodies of children living near fracking wells were up to 91 times as high as the average American, and substantially higher than levels seen in the average adult cigarette smoker. The governor, Governor Wolf, has deputized researchers at the University of Pittsburgh to determine whether there is any connection between fracking in Washington County and these illnesses that have been occurring in children. Unfortunately, this study is as Eliza Griswold, the New Yorker reporter, reported, it may not actually discern that connection because of the way it's working. And there's just historically been a problem with accountability between our state and our State Department of Environmental Protection and the ability to hold frackers accountable. There's actually a very damning grand jury report in 2020 conducted by the Office of the Attorney General that quoted testimony from people who had suffered from fracking pollution. And I'm just going to quote from that report right now. Then there was the air. The smell from putrefying wastewater in open pits was nauseating. Airborne chemicals burned the throat and irritated exposed skin. One witness had a name for it, frack rash. It felt like having alligator skin. At night, children would get intense nosebleeds. The blood would just pour out. Many of those living in close proximity to a well pad began to become chronically and inexplicably sick. Pets died. Farm animals that lived outside started miscarrying or giving birth to deformed offspring. But the worst was the children, who were the most susceptible to the effects. Families went to their doctors for answers, but the doctors didn't know what to do. This is actually one of the image from Eliza Griswold's piece of one of the children who had died from Ewing sarcoma. And this is the PES oil refinery when it was still active, which is in the 1st Senate District. And our panel is about a Green New Deal, and one thing that we learned from these stories about fracking is that our children and our Commonwealth residents need a right to breathe across our Commonwealth. Everyone needs a right to take a deep breath in our landscapes, our homes, and our schools. And right now, people don't have that right, or really that right is just routinely abrogated, and overwhelmingly in low-income Black and Brown communities across our state. When I ran for office last year, I ran for and will fight for a Green New Deal for Pennsylvania, as was discussed earlier, a Green New Deal for housing and schools. Because our fight against climate change is not a retreat from any kind of quality of life, but an attempt to achieve one. It is not a gamble that our lives will get worse, but that they could be measurably better. The cost of fracking is on the production side for fossil fuels, but a Green New Deal framework recognizes that the cost is also on the consumption side. Oil that is dug up in the West, PA had the first oil boom in the United States, is refined in the East. This cost is in the gas that heats our stoves, that increase asthma rates by 42%. The 1/3 of households that cannot afford their utility bills, burdens that are borne overwhelmingly by Black families in houses that tend to have ineffective insulation. A Green New Deal framework is also the promise of work that our society takes on collectively to heal and repair itself, to repair our aging home and school infrastructure, to connect homes and schools to renewable energy, and to produce equity across our landscape. Why do we need a Green New Deal for Pennsylvania in particular? I think we tend to think in Pennsylvania and across the United States, and we certainly had this perception for a long time, as climate change as something that is far away or is somehow distant from us. But in fact, we are the kind of source of climate change. Our states are. Nationally, the top 10 emitting states are responsible for nearly 50% of the country's total emissions, and Pennsylvania is in the top 5. Our Commonwealth is responsible for about 1% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. A 2020 climate change impact assessment by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, just lost my panel, my document. 2020 impact assessed that every county in the state will continue to get warmer and wetter, and average rainfall and extreme precipitation will increase 8 to 12%, particularly in winter and spring. Flooding throughout the state will damage infrastructure, and southwestern Pennsylvania will face additional risks for landslides. Counties facing the greatest impacts are, of course, also the poorest. On the micro level, people's homes will be damaged by rising floodwaters, and studies connect increased flooding and water damage with mold in people's homes and increased incidence of asthma. The other thing that we should recognize is that our state devotes, fracking isn't just a business or that occurs because there's a market for it. There are immense subsidies that our state devotes to them. And in any Green New Deal, we would need to retreat or repeal those subsidies. So according to Penn Future, there were $3.8 billion in fossil fuel subsidies for fiscal year 2019, or about $296 per Pennsylvania resident. This represents a 14% increase since 2015, which means our fossil fuel subsidy problem in Pennsylvania is getting worse. 52.1% of that subsidy went to the shale gas industry. The gas industry is also estimated to have caused at least $11.1 billion in external damages in 2019, including water well contamination, health impacts like asthma and cancer, and damages to public infrastructure for an average of $867 per Pennsylvania resident. These impacts are borne disproportionately by residents who live close to shale gas development. And these heavily impact communities, residents are more likely to be Black, brown, and poor. According to the Ohio River Valley Institute, 22 counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia produce about 90% of the region's shale gas. The gas industry sold itself to the state on the promise of nearly 500,000 new jobs in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Instead, a decade later, even though these counties had an increased economic output, the residents' personal incomes lowered, their number of jobs lowered, and their population rates decreased. Rather than being forced to bear the financial failure, the natural gas companies received subsidies, as we discussed, and passed the hardship on to the people who they had promised to lift up financially. So this is the situation in which we invest overwhelmingly as a state in these industries that I think, as we agree here, need to be we need to retreat from these subsidies. We need to be retreating from these industries. We also experience this just in our own, in sort of more immediate ways, just in our utilities. So in order to achieve an energy transition, we have to reckon with the fact that some of our utilities are actually opposed to the work that we're trying to do. So this is the PGW, Philadelphia Gas Works. Philadelphia Gas Works is a public utility. It's owned by the city and ostensibly should be guided by the city's plans to cut carbon pollution by 80% by 2050. Unfortunately, it is actually siding with the gas industry against proposals that would help the city achieve its goals. PGW has fought building codes that would curb the use of natural gas, and it is using ratepayer dollars to pay money to gas trade groups that oppose electrification. This is horrendous for many reasons, including that utility debt and shutoffs are huge for people in Pennsylvania and Philly. People earning low incomes in Philadelphia pay 23% of their incomes on utility bills. The average for other people is 6% of their income. 23%, that's just on utilities, so not even including rent or home ownership costs. So this is one big part of the energy transition that we would need to reckon with in our city and just just across, it's elements of this exist across our state. On a slightly more positive note, this is not a Green New Deal initiative, but it has relevance for us, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the first mandatory cap and trade program in the United States to limit carbon dioxide from the power sector. Across the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania is the only state that has not joined the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. If you look at a map of states that have made this commitment, Pennsylvania shows as a kind of whole. It offers a lot for Pennsylvanians: cleaner air and water, more sustainable jobs that pay living wages, healthier communities and families. But beyond these gains, RGGI has been an investment opportunity for future states, and this is where a Green New Deal framework is useful. Neighboring states that already participate in RGGI have been able to invest millions of dollars back into their economies. The largest percentage of RGGI proceeds go to energy efficiency programs that retrofit homes and businesses, save consumers money on their energy bills, and train workers in a growing industry. As we plan for the future, we have an opportunity to ensure the communities that have suffered the most from fossil fuel extraction and pollution are not just treated equitably, but seek targeted benefits of this investment. Right now, without additional action from legislators, money for RGGI is limited to programs that reduce air pollution. But this gives us options, Green New Deal legislators, to invest at the intersection of economic, racial, and climate justice. We can use the money to retrofit and weatherize people's homes, to make an immediate change in people's lives and a permanent change in energy use. We know this is sorely needed. Philadelphia ranks 4th for highest energy burden on low-income households. If we act, and more specifically, if we engage with Reggie and specifically the majority, we could also make it possible for money to use to support and expand workforce training programs that would support communities in transition. So just these are ways that, this is just an example of the kind of housing that we could be building in Philadelphia, which actually exists. This is Paseo Verde in North Philadelphia, which is one of the greenest housing developments in the United States. It is something that we can do with dollars, and just think about the way that we can move away from subsidies for fossil fuels, away from emissions, and towards investments in things that we can actually see in our daily lives. So I just want to, close out by just saying that, I'm really glad to be here with my colleagues with City Council. I'm really looking forward to hearing Councilmembers Gim and Brooks talk about their work, and just know that, a Green New Deal is just powerful because of the intersection of all these things that we're talking about: racial, economic, and climate justice. Green New Deal in particular, that includes energy efficiency measures and home weatherization, would make people's lives immediately better. It would enable them to keep their homes warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, combating heat islands, and it would have an immediate and permanent effect on energy usage and in decreasing utility bills. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the Q&A and to hearing from my colleagues.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I think that's a really robust framework for thinking about a Green New Deal for Pennsylvania. Councilmember Brooks, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today, and I'm excited to be among the leaders and the visionaries, that are dedicated to fighting for a just, livable Philadelphia. These conversations are critical to building both the vision and the relationships we will need to transform our local economy and achieve real climate justice, within our lifetime. So today I'll be talking briefly about some initial work that my office has been doing in the areas of climate justice and housing, land ownership, and a path forward to win a local Green New Deal. Right now, a critical part of building the momentum we need to pass transformative legislation in Philadelphia is we need relationship building and learning from the successes from across the country. So last summer, my office took a trip to Baltimore, and we were joined by Senator Saval, a Green New Deal policy expert, Daniel Aldana Cohen, and Philadelphia housing activists. During our visit, we met with Baltimore organizers doing the work around land sovereignty and food access, green affordable housing, urban farming and composting, and community land trust. What we know is that Baltimore and Philly share many similarities in terms of housing stock and the demographic makeup. So when we return home, we have built strong bonds and ideas on how to replicate some of the work that we saw in Baltimore here in Philly. So for example, both Philly and Baltimore have a high concentration of row homes. While our aging housing stock poses some challenges to transitioning to green energy, it also presents advantages. And row homes lend themselves well to affordable green retrofits. So when we are lobbying for a Green New Deal for Philadelphia, we need to make sure the solutions we propose are unique to our regional characteristics. We were inspired by the work that we saw around community land trusts. The community land trusts are nonprofit organizations governed by a board of residents and community members that provide lasting community assets and shared equity opportunities for families. Following it, my office co-hosted a follow-up, a political education event on land justice. And that brought together organizers from Philadelphia and Baltimore to talk about community land trust, land ownership, housing, and climate justice. And all of this work is just part of vision building, because what we know is that Any effective Green New Deal must put the power in the hands of the people, not wealthy developers or private entities. The movement groups are going to play a critical role in pushing for a Green New Deal because we have people power, and we should really be using it at this time. So my office has been meeting regularly with climate justice and housing justice organizations to bring them into the work and build the shared vision that we're talking about. And we were lucky to have some vibrant movement ecosystem fighting for a green just Philadelphia already existing. And we're talking about groups like Soil Generation, Philly 350, 1PA, 215 People's Alliance, Philly Thrive, the Sunrise Movement, Reclaim Philadelphia, Penn Futures, and many others that were already playing a leading role in this work. So I am someone that comes from a restorative background, restorative justice background. And I also was a restorative justice practitioner for a number of years. And I view the Philly New Deal, Green New Deal, as a way to repair harms that decades of disinvestment, systemic racism, and exploitation has caused. So as most of you know, many of the programs set forth by the original New Deal excluded Black people, and they were the driving force behind state-sanctioned segregation. And what we see is that these ripple effects are still felt by our communities in Philadelphia today. And if we do not actively combat the systems of oppression in our approach to climate justice, we will just replicate them. So when we think of our version for a Green New Deal here in Philly, it needs to foreground the struggles of working class people of color. And it needs to give power back to the people who are most harmed by housing discrimination, toxic environmental conditions, and extreme weather events, and just neglect to the infrastructure. And we need to look at neighborhoods in Philly, like where I live in Nicetown, a Black working class neighborhood where the life expectancy is almost a decade lower than whites, and in wealthy neighborhoods, and where 1 in 3 kids has asthma. We need to ask ourselves how a Green New Deal could make these communities livable and safe for years to come. And that's the only way that we're going to get this widespread buy-in that we need. And lastly, we need to seize the opportunity for a Green New Deal to be a part of a long-term pandemic recovery. Crises are also opportunities, and they're opportunities for transformative change. And we should be thinking about it as a way to transform our local economy and create good unionized jobs. The way to repair the crumbling infrastructure of neighborhoods that have been neglected for generations is by employing people whose lives have been most impacted by this pandemic. And we need to fund the Green New Deal by having everyone, including the ultra wealthy billionaire class, pay their fair share for public goods. We know that the pandemic recovery has shown us that massive investments are possible when we break out of this austerity mindset. The stimulus bill at the federal level is a good start to recovering some of these losses of this past year, but we know that restoring our budget to the status quo will not be enough, and it is not enough. And a Green New Deal for Philadelphia is an opportunity for us to put forth a positive vision for what we want for the future generations, for our kids and grandkids, and right the wrongs of decades of regressive policies. So I'm so excited to continue these conversations and collaborate with my colleagues, Councilmember Gim and Senator Saval, and State Rep Donna Bullock, and the policy experts like Billy and Akira. It will take all of us if we want to win a Green New Deal. And I look forward to fighting alongside all of you. So, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for all of that. I mean, it's super excellent and very inspiring, and thank you for your leadership. Councilmember Gim, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much, Neil. Well, I'm honored. I'm Helen Gim. I'm honored to join all of you. And I think Akira Drake Rodriguez called all of you the Green New Deal Legal Squad. So I'm honored to be here with the Green New Deal Legal Squad that's going to build a generation of Green New Deal attorneys to make sure that what we're talking about today and what we're able to win in our politics actually survives and thrives through policy. And really appreciate the role that Temple Law and you have played in building out an ethos around public service that isn't just about the idea of a Green New Deal movement, but how to actually put one into practice. And I hope that, after hearing so many speakers, I'd love to be able to talk a little bit about how a movement grows. Because I think if we truly want to create a Green New Deal in practice, we have to understand it, not so much as a platform, but as a process for how we win in our politics, in our society, in our economy, and through our infrastructure. And a lot of my remarks will not so much be about the what, but about the how that we do it. In part because I want us to be careful about not just relying on copying and marking up a kind of blueprint, but really investing in communities' capacity and appetite for organizing, for agency, and for change. Fundamentally, the environmental justice movement is about building and rebuilding an economy of care, the kind of economy and society that isn't just about fossil fuels, but it's about education, food, and affordable transit, and the human rights to housing, healthcare, and clean air and water that we all both need and deserve. I have spent 20 years in organizing in Philadelphia, and I come out of communities, many of them immigrant communities, Asian American communities, that have not traditionally seen themselves within our movement, within our political structures, and we are still nonetheless deeply impacted by policies of oppression, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy that have crushed our communities. We have been deported and detained at ungodly and immoral levels. We have lost our communities to developers and mayors who would try to take public land for private profit. We have fought for access within our public schools. And we've done so even when we don't speak English, even when we are not even recognized as citizens of this nation. And yet that is why my fundamental start with anything that we do has always been to fight for and establish the visibility, voice, and self-determination of people, to center their issues and to figure out the path through. So, Akira Drake Rodriguez talked extensively, and my colleagues, Billy Fleming and Senator Saval and Councilmember Brooks have talked extensively about different issues. Akira talked significantly about the schools issue. And one of the things that I want to, which I'll be spending some time on, is to recognize that the schools issue is, if it's exciting to you, it's not because it's just about schools, but it's about a vibrant movement that came up to make schools the kind of issue that we want to talk about. I am a mother of 3 children. A former public school teacher, really got started when we fought off the state takeover of the public school systems. We have taken on, governors and mayors who would close down our public schools and replace them with for-profit entities or other means of charterization or privatization of our schools. We've fought against massive school cuts and budget cuts. We stood by our young people when they were bullied and harassed, beaten and threatened in our classrooms. We stood up for our educators and for a vision to end grotesque abuses around suspending kindergartners or seeing such unjust uses of the school to prison pipeline. We've fought to reform our juvenile justice systems. We've talked about the role of transit. All of these things make us realize that the movement around public schools became something that both grew up when we almost lost our system to a for-profit agency in 2001 around the state takeover of public schools, through a series of movements that only expanded the capacity to grow. So when I came on to City Council in 2016, there was no question that I came on with a schools agenda that started out by looking at the fact that in 2016, Flint, Michigan had poisoned children and whole communities in predominantly Black Flint for profit. And in wake of that, we knew that we wanted to build out a big vision for how we care for young people, how we take a look at our water systems, which were at the time defiantly defended as being the highest, best quality. But what we did was we started with all these town halls. We started having conversations about what was happening in our public schools. We centered youth voices in majority Black and brown schools. And one of the things that came out through all of these town halls is that these young people did not have guaranteed access to safe drinking water. And so out of that work, we won a small $1 million investment from the schools, from the school district itself, to put modern water stations in every single public school. That expanded to an effort around lead testing that became a demand for transparency and reporting and accountability for lead and the toxicity of our school buildings. Without that kind of data, we wouldn't actually know what institutions do to our children and how we fight it. The water campaign became embraced by the school district of Philadelphia because, surprise, surprise, when issues come out of actual needs and desires of the students that you serve and the people who go through their building, they're going to not only be possible, affordable, but they will also be wildly popular. That became the basis of the school district's Green Schools initiative. That let the coalition that built around it became the Healthy Schools Coalition. Labor unions came on board because it created actual jobs. And from there, that initial $1 million investment became this broad-based investment to modernize, ramp up, talk about the healthy conditions of the school buildings that we send all of our children to, that we mandate that kids go into 180 school days a year. That $1 million investment in 2016 became, in 2019, a $500 million bond initiative by the School District of Philadelphia, including a commitment to air conditioning and cooling, including commitments around lead, asbestos, and mold remediation. And the American Rescue Plan, of course, that has been announced, promises the possibility of even more. From schools, we can talk about the fact that thousands of children take SEPTA back and forth, that we are in a city that is not only the poorest large city in the country, but is also a city that has one of the most expensive transit systems. So young people have been active in fighting for a more just, a more affordable, and a greener SEPTA public transit system. And this year in 2020, or last year in 2020, we actually won free transit for children under 12. Eliminating transfer fees. We are talking about moving SEPTA to a green fuel program to ensure that we save money and not to just reduce costs, but to reinvest them in the things that make young people's lives better, that makes SEPTA more affordable to lots of different communities, and to ensure, again, that an environmental justice agenda is closely tied with an agenda that challenges poverty, that addresses racial inequity and injustice, and is driven by the people who are most impacted by it. Of course, now COVID presents one of the greatest threats ever to all of our communities. But again, the vibrancy of the schools movement meant that ventilation, breathability, cleanliness, and school reform and school modernization are now top of mind. They're the things that we talk about in home and school association meetings, around teaching tables, in front of the school board, and now before the Biden administration. And as this world gets hotter, our schools and classrooms, which were already non-modernized, where you can see temperature drops of over 50 degrees, in which schools actually have to open later in the school district of Philadelphia than in other modern, wealthier counties beyond us. They can start in August because they have air conditioning. Our children actually lose out on weeks of schooling that could start early in the year because we do not have those kinds of modern systems. I want us to think about the fact that there was a school, Ben Franklin High School, that went that had existed for years, decades, in a place where asbestos literally poisoned the school. And it wasn't until a more diverse white families started moving in, wealthier families began to co-locate within the school, that finally there was a need to report out what was happening, to remediate what's happening at the school. It is wrong, unjust, and what we have to recognize is that the remediation related directly to issues around racial justice, and the ability for communities to fight back against significant disinvestments around their schools. So, you know, at the very start, you know, we don't ever just talk about school modernization that is not fundamentally also about ensuring that any investments in schools will never be about closing down or selling off school buildings. It will never be about firing teachers and nurses and classroom aides. In fact, if we are investing in our schools, if we are investing in an environmental agenda, we want to make sure that we actually double the ranks of the people within our schools, that we get our students jobs and apprenticeships. And we remind ourselves that when we build up a city, we actually build up the people who live in it. So when if I could say that the focus here, again, is that it's not so much about this amazing thing that we can do with schools that Akira or myself can lay out, but it's again reminding ourselves that we have to invest in the movements that make schools a point of possibility, a vibrant movement that makes it a place where we can actually win. And so if all of us who are in the climate justice movement care about a broader, bigger Green New Deal movement, then we have to embed ourselves within the organizing that makes it possible, whether it's about schools, whether it's about housing, whether it's about fracking. But when schools people, when housing people, and when fracking, people who are fighting fracking, see themselves within a climate justice movement, then we can truly grow. I want us to take the lessons from the struggles that we actually win on, recognize places where we see movement and mobility and agency from a diverse group of new people raising up their voices, and use it as a way in which we can orient ourselves within this Green New Deal movement, anchor it in this world that actually is grounded. When we talk about, when Akira Drake Rodriguez talks about grounding it in people, it means that we have to see them making change, making movements, and then we can scale up our wins. And as you heard, with from Senator Saval and with Councilmember Brooks, there's so much more that we have the possibility to do, because fundamentally a Green New Deal in Philadelphia means not just transforming and modernizing our public schools. It means that we stop the flooding in Eastwick. It means we bring decency and livability to PHA. It means that we make SEPTA transit cheaper, freer, more accessible for all the communities who, a third of whom don't have a car and can't afford one. And what's great about the Green New Deal is that it helps us get beyond how we, you know, tinker and fight back, but actually fundamentally how we restructure movements, how we begin to put care and people first. That means that we build locally, and then we can scale up nationally. And I'm proud to be here with all of the movement leaders who are on here, who remind us that we can only move forward when we build up from below and we keep our policy connected and embedded within our people.
Thank you for that, Councilmember Gim. Again, really excellent. Just to summarize some of the themes I heard throughout these introductory remarks. First, a fossil fuel economy is not working for Pennsylvania, and it's not working for Pennsylvanians. Two, divesting from fossil fuels and investing in the care economy is necessarily the same as investing in our communities, investing in minority communities, investing in women, investing in the kind of work that has historically gone undervalued. It's a transitioning of focus as to what gets value in our economy. And third, we got to organize. You got to be part of movements. You got to participate and support the movements that are actually making the political conditions of a Green New Deal possible. So hopefully that was a faithful rendition of some of the themes that you three also eloquently laid out for us. I'd like to open the floor now to a Q&A, and because of timing, I want to open this up to everybody and also open it up to the panelists who were on before. If you have any questions for anyone who's up here, please raise your hand or just submit it through the Q&A function. And while people do figure out if they want to raise hands and stuff, I will ask a couple questions that have come through the Q&A function. Okay, so first, this is a question for Billy. Billy, in the conversation of decarceration, do you have an opinion on the Renewable Rikers Act that was passed last month? They claim it's a huge step towards reparative justice and battling environmental racism for low-income communities and communities of color. Is it enough? Is it mostly PR for NYC? Is it worth replicating in Appalachia, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think the unsatisfying answer on my end is I haven't been involved in much of that work, so it's hard for me to try and speak intelligently about it. And I would take my cues from folks in New York who've been working on it, and not from me. I will say, the Rikers situation is one that often I think people try to think about replicating in other places. But the reality is we've built way too many freaking prisons in this country to try and do either like a mass solar or a museum or like other cultural institution out of every prison facility that we've been able to do. And so I think whatever works in New York is not necessarily going to work in other places, because not every prison facility has the same kind of visibility, the same kind of years of organizing around it as Rikers. And we're going to have to find other ways to decommission and reuse or demolish, the tens of thousands of those around the country.
So another question that came in from the audience, question for Senator Saval: if Pennsylvania joins RGGI, actually I'm not sure how they pronounce it, RGGI, is there a risk that its energy problems might simply transfer to nearby non-RGGI states such as Ohio? And I understand that New Jersey joined, exited, and rejoined RGGI. Is there anything we can learn from this history?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say that, just as a framing, I mean, RGGI is actually, in a way, it's like it sort of predates the kind of Green New Deal framework that we're talking about. I mean, it's a cap and trade scheme. It's not, in a way, as policy. It's all the policies that have been discussed on this panel are much more ambitious and require much more like direct state intervention. The interest for me is actually the possibility that one, within the state framework, there are very few ways in which the state, given the composition of the legislature, can directly impact the emissions from the fossil fuel industry. And this is one of them that the state can enter without actually legislative approval. And then the result of it is that actually there's funding streams that come in from it that then make certain other initiatives that we're trying to pursue possible, and or at least theoretically. And so among the ones that Akira and Billy have worked on, the council members Kim and Brooks were talking about. I mean, just like these direct investments in equity in infrastructure. So that's sort of where I would place the emphasis. It just is alive, in general. And just stepping back for a second, there are a weird number of state programs, especially as we dig in. I'm new, and so as you kind of dig in, you're just like, oh, there's this program that exists. There's the state publicly subsidized venture capital firms to do what? The state has a weatherization program. How many people are serviced by it? And you just are like, what are the state has a school construction program that's unfunded. I mean, you're like, well, should I invent a new program, or should we actually fund this thing and do it better? And so that's sort of the other context in which I'm framing it. But yeah, I mean, the New Jersey did exit under Chris Christie. I mean, that is a danger of these programs, is that they're subject to kind of gubernatorial caprice, and that's, but I think we have to I think in that, as far as I know, is the only state that's entered and exited, and it's just rejoined. And actually, I believe, I could be mistaken, it's now thinking about, given the kind of framework that we're all dealing with now, some of the funding decisions that they're making are really centering, frontline communities and things like that, or at least they potentially. So that's how I think about it.
Thanks for that. Another question from the audience is, and it's related to the issue of funding streams. Question for Councilmember Gim. I saw you mention pilots in the response to another question. I was just curious to hear your and other assessments of both how politically feasible implementing I think these Green New Deal policies would be in Philadelphia, and how necessary they would, or sorry, I think implementing pilots in Philadelphia and how necessary they would be in terms of funding some of these programs and initiatives at the state and local level. If anyone else wants to chime in on that too, you're welcome to. Councilmember Brooks, if you know, as a fellow city council member, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that we did win a pilot. We won a $100 million pilot from Penn, $10 million a year over 10 years, which, you know, whatever people may think, you should consider it a pilot. It is an investment specifically around the remediation of asbestos, mold, and lead. The question is whether that becomes widely embraced and whether Penn puts more in than just, you know, 10 million a year. But there's no question that the appetite and the possibilities exist. It's clear that Penn felt that it was compelled to put in some money towards this, made an announcement around it, and then our responsibility is whether or not they call it a pilot is not really up to, it doesn't matter. Like, we are creating vehicles for this. So don't get hung up on whether or not they called it a pilot. It is a pilot. It is what they put money into a pot that does deal with the remediation. Now, what we do with it, how we expand it to Temple and to other places, including Comcast, other places like that, is up to us. And I think I wrote in there, there's a couple of things that I want us to think about in terms of like this conversation. Number one, no pilot is going to offset the fundamental funding inequity that exists at the state and federal level. So right now, and I wrote this in earlier, you know, there is a state funding boost by the governor that's in front of him for the budget. There's a lawsuit in front of, went before the PA Supreme Court, and I believe it gets bounced back to Commonwealth Court, where there will be a trial sometime in the fall. And then on top of that, there is whatever's promised through the American Rescue Plan, through the Biden administration, and how schools will be interpreted. So no pilot is meant to offset that. No one, so at scale, that's what it does look like. It means fighting for current budget allotments now, a restructuring and a legal lawsuit through the efforts for fair and equitable funding of our school system, and then putting into play like the billions of dollars that are currently being offered on the table and making sure that some of that is accessed. What a pilot program does do is it will provide some amount of infrastructure. I think it can provide like not an insignificant amount. So for example, a $10 million a year investment from Penn, which could probably like double or triple that amount easily, could then convert into other companies paying in, and it could get to a sizable amount. But at the end of the day, the point of the pilot is not so much like winning it in name, but to really use it as a vehicle to leverage the other stuff that's happening at the state and federal level, to demand that the cost of us not having a functioning like education funding formula or an inequitable funding formula is that we will go after these places. The cost of allowing us to do tax-free building on, you know, like a tower by Comcast that is the most modern, you know, building in the world and costs millions upon millions of dollars, is and to have it be next door to schools that literally don't even have air conditioning, literally cannot like go to the bathroom without it being flooded over. So the cost is going to be this pilot program. The pilot is a start, but it's more importantly, a vehicle for embracing the concept that all of us are bought into this, and that actually infrastructure, and one of the appeals of the Green New Deal, right, is that it is about the literal rebuilding of our economy and potentially our city. So that the schools can be a vehicle to see goodwill, you know, even if it's not joined by it, but it can be a place of goodwill. You can places of modernization, some real movement in places where, you know, we get stuck a lot of times when we think about, you know, more long-term kinds of areas. But I hope people see it in both those ways. And I hope people also see that we did win. We did win the first steps towards that. And it's our responsibility to then go out and build.
Councilmember Brooks or anyone else, would anyone like to add on to that conversation?
I mean, I would just like to add that, it's going to take, we have been fighting for pilots or whatever they want to call them for quite some time. And it's going to continue to take movement groups to step up and continue to push this initiative. We, in my office, have already started doing our rounds of conversation about pilots to the large nonprofits. Because the reality, to my colleague's point, we appreciate Penn making that contribution, but the reality is, if pilots were a true thing, they would have had to pay that in 1 year, not over 10 years. So we need not just Penn, to my colleague's point, all major nonprofits to pay their fair share in order for us to have the solid infrastructure we need around schools, or just for this Philadelphia economy to bounce back. And I think that, it's our responsibility to continue to push that everyone pays their fair share, and that these investments that these corporations are making into the city are benefiting the city, not just, their small subsection of, their students and staff. And that's what we have to continue to push for.
Excellent. So we're at 2:02 right now. The event was originally supposed to end at 2. I apologize, everyone, for going a little bit over. I feel like this conversation is really generative, so I do want to ask one last question that wraps in a question from the audience, and a question I'm going to kind of throw on top of that. Would that be all right for the people, for all the panelists on the stage? Thank you so much for your patience, and then we'll close out around 2:10. So the last question is, so first the question is, how do you reconcile the conflict of centering the agency of the communities most impacted by environmental degradation when many of those communities, in maybe places like Appalachia and Pennsylvania, have been overwhelmingly supporting politicians who do not support G&D policies? And I'll add on to that. I think another way to look at this is sort of, where are the coalition partners? How do we think differently about the way politics play out across the state and across different parts of this country, to see that there's actually more of an alignment than there is disagreement? And that's open to anybody who wants to step up for it.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Akira.
I'm not a politician, so it's easy for me to answer this, and that, like, I don't really care how it's framed. And I don't really care if you support people who support it, right? Like, I don't, you're going to get it anyway. I think the idea is just packaging it and really taking the expansive definition of all of these individual items. So I don't care if this gets parsed into reconciliation, if it's like happening at 17 different levels of government. I'm concerned about it hitting the ground and having an impact. And so, and I think what's really helpful to resistance to these ideas is that people sort of say, oh, this doesn't relate to me because X, Y, Z. And you say, oh, no, actually it does, right? Like, that's an opportunity to engage people and understand, again, what we're seeing as this very narrow sort of, oh, we have to green this and it has to go from brown to green, look very pretty, is something that is not just that. And so, like, thinking together and collaboratively, again, this is not a politically expedient answer, but it is, a way of actually building that buy-in that takes longer than the election cycle. So I had the benefit of being able to say, like, whatever. That's not how it actually works in practice, but it is certainly, I think, the reason why we need this to be a movement with so many different actors.
I'll be a little quick. It's actually something I wanted to stay around the pilots conversation a little bit, which is like, if you ask yourself like what the appetite is around politics and politicians right now, it's nowhere. Like, our current political system is about oppression, patriarchy, capitalism, exploitation, and ultimately the harm that has come to so many of our communities. It takes so much money to keep all of us so poor in our thinking, in our economy, in all of this. And no, I never start with like, what's the appetite for? I assume it's freaking nowhere. And part of politics is about change, not measuring the political wins, but actually about changing them. Like, I don't care. I know what this political moment means for immigrant folks. I know what this political moment means for young people and teenagers who go through our public school system. I know what this political moment means for Black and Brown and BIPOC and immigrant communities all over the city of Philadelphia. It is unjust, it is immoral, and it's got to end. So you don't go there. Where you go and where you feel the sense of energy, the unity, is with nurses and teachers. You feel it with students and children and retirees and family members. You find it on playgrounds and in backyard barbecues. You go to the places where people have voice and agency, power, and are speaking in a different type of language than all the people that we've heard before. Anything that I've ever done has never started with a formal public hearing and a bunch of talking heads with a lot of initials around their after their name. It's always started and been grounded in the actual experiences of people, because what people experience is shameful, because what they experience is inhumane, and because what they experience is something that you actually cannot turn away from. So our compelling responsibility is that if we're going to go up against Harrisburg, if we're going to go up against, you know, any administration, if you're going to go up against a bunch of developers and mayors and others, then you better bring an army with you. And you're not going to find that army in City Hall or in a state legislature or anywhere in Congress, even though there are amazing warriors within them. You're going to find the army within our communities. And part of what I want us to talk about is that the Green New Deal, one of the dangers of both policy and organizing is we spend a lot of time in organizing, analyzing the enemy, and we spend a lot of time in policy analyzing like platforms and things. But actually the vehicle for both is that we don't spend enough time understanding our strengths within our communities, understanding the people that can make networks, understanding the people who can come up and speak in a different way than anybody has ever heard, so that more people sit up and listen and more people say, you got to come hear what this person has to say. And I hope that what comes out of this and what all of you are doing as the future generation of the Green New Deal Legal Squad is that you will see your public interest lawyering tied very closely to the organizations and communities and work to uplift their voices as opposed to any kind of a specific platform. Because when people are empowered, everything is possible. Everything is possible. And when we're silent, when we're marginalized, when we're disinvested in, then the forces kind of like come in. But our purpose is to be inevitable in this moment, to fill every single space that we possibly can, and then to never quit investing in ourselves.
Would anyone else
like a million? I was just saying, yeah, if this was like a Zoom chat with just like the 6 of us, I would just have been like plussing all of those comments in the chat, because those were fantastic. I'll just say quickly, I mean, I also have the luxury of like not having to worry about some of this stuff like Akira, but I do spend a lot of time worried about it. Look, I grew up in public housing in rural Arkansas and still do most of my field work in the rural South. And so I think a lot about the ways we have to kind of modulate how we talk about and think about like what we mean by the Green New Deal. And I think it's especially important for this question about Appalachia, which, you know, for 50 years now, since like 1962, the official policy of the federal government has been to depopulate Appalachia through divestment, to starve it of resources and force people to leave because things have become so desperate. And I can't imagine like writing off a swath of the country who have like a very understandable reaction to that maybe doesn't align them in obvious ways with the way that like my friends in Brooklyn talk about the Green New Deal. And I think if the idea was to roll out the GND, at least like in its first wave in the places that are already obviously lined up to support it, then like, you know, Brooklyn, Center City, Brentwood, like they're going to look a lot like that meme of West Virginia after Joe Manchin like wins a bunch of concessions from Biden. It was just like, I don't know, some eco-techno utopian future. But I think for me, like the theory of change behind some of this work is just that no one is going to understand, and we can't expect them to understand something like the Green New Deal through a change in carbon molecules in the atmosphere or like the source of the electrons in their circuits. We're never going to log on to, hopefully we're not logging on to Zoom anymore after this year, but if we are, we're not going to know that our computer is being powered by wind instead of coal. But you are going to know when there are real, like I should be wearing my Nikil Saval has a materialist analysis shirt for this. But you know, there are real like materialist ways to think about driving investments in how and where people live. and all of the bits of civic infrastructure that stitch together their everyday lives, that make the benefits of the Green New Deal like obvious and visceral to the people who like need it the most, whether they like will be out there at like a Green New Deal march with the Sunrise Movement or not. And you know, I think one of the ways you win people over is by making those benefits clear. And I think one of the ways you have to approach it, which I think, you know, the three leaders on here who have been doing this so well from City Council and the state legislature have done it, is to just say sometimes like to hell with the optics and you do what's right and you sort of lead on some of these things. And I wish we had a million more like y'all in city councils and legislatures around the world.
Can I add just one more thing to that? I think what we see here between Senator Saval, Councilmember Gim, and myself, folks that came out of movements, came out of spaces that needed to see the change. And I think, you know, even though the politicians that are in place in those areas, the work that we do here and how we take it back into communities determine the leadership that we see next. And I think we have to continue to keep that messaging moving and going. And it's not a popular answer for a politician to say, but like I ran on a third party ticket, did something and somebody said that it was impossible to do. And I came from worried about the power plant that's being built up the street from my house, worrying about my kids' schools being closed, like not coming out of politics, came from movement spaces. And actually somebody just asked me to come to a meeting. Who would have thought, you know, 10 years later, here I am, city council. And I think those are the stories that we, except Helen, but those are the stories that we need to get in those communities, because reminding people that we are the change that we want to see. So we have to step up to the plate and make a difference. And sometimes it means stepping in this political realm. And that's how we're going to see that change.
All right, Senator Saval, would you like to add anything to that, or?
This is, I mean, it's just, I just could, I mean, except that's amazing. The one thing I would just say that like is, on the, I just feel like it may not, I don't know how clear it is, but just, I feel it very acutely, which is just like the continuum between organizing and policy work is so fluid right now. It just like with Akira and Billy, like we've all, I mean, I feel like we've all worked my policies that I ran on, they wrote, you know, like we just, it all just, and we were just doing, it just kind of all worked in movement spaces. I mean, we're all just doing this together. I just want to say that that just feels like, I mean, I guess I'm new to this, so I don't really know, but it feels new to me. It also feels a new aspect of this, of the way policy is being done and the way the way ideas are being generated, like they're generated from movements. And there's just constant like testing of these ideas in movement spaces. I just feel like it's really exciting. And I don't know, I like that has been one of the more like incredible like experiences. And I just feel like it's different. I mean, this is new. We're taught, this is like the Green New Deal, the resolution came out a little over a year ago, 2 years ago, just two. Yeah, right. I mean, it's like and here we are, and it's this like, I mean, so I just feel like we're the power of this is like, no one would have said, you know, speaking to Councilmember Gim's point, and like no one would have, you know, these are the things that people thought were BS, like that, you know, and were impossible. So, but there is this groundswell, and it has, because it is about real changes in people's lives. So.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a more inspiring note to end on. And it's really been incredible talking to everybody. Thank you all for your time and for participating in this panel discussion. To everyone who's attended, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being with us today. That is the end of our event, but definitely not the end of the movement, and definitely not the end of the work. So after this, for Temple Law students, we're gonna have, or actually for everybody, we're gonna have another event on April 9th about environmental, like the federal government's new environmental justice policy. Shalonda Baker, who was recently appointed to the Department of Energy, is going to be speaking at that and talking about like Biden's EJ40 vision, which definitely ties into this stuff. But also, let's just keep these conversations going. I mean, like, I think what's been made clear in a lot of these, a lot of things that have been said today is that we as people need to be moving and organizing and like making these, you know, dreaming up beautiful visions of the world we want to live in, and then making them real and demanding that, you know, people with power actually realize them. And then second, as lawyers, I think we have a lot of technical capacity to translate the demands of movements into policy that can be written into law. So stay grounded, stay moving. Thank you, everyone. I just want to quickly say thank you to some of the organizers that have been doing a lot behind the scenes to make this possible today. Thank you, Narim Gasu, Ben Villa, Brittany Martinez, Kristen Nichols, Sharice Pavia, Professor Amy Sinden, Len Reeser in the Scheller Center and the NRDC. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, just because I think the robustness and broadness of our co-sponsors just demonstrates how intersectional this movement is. We have the Black Law Students Association, the Latin American Law Students Association, Asian Pacific American Law Student Association, Middle Eastern North African Law Student Association, the Brehons, the Women's Law Caucus, the Jewish Law Students Association, the Temple's chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, the Student Public Interest Network, and the Political and Civil Rights Society. So thank you all for coming out. This is just the beginning, and I'm really excited to continue doing this work with everyone. Thank you.